She called me a housemaid in my own home, and everyone stayed silent. But I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Because I already had a plan. And by the end of it, she would be the one walking out that door. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental. The day I stepped into my husband's home, I carried more than just my suitcase. I carried hope, excitement, and a quiet belief that I was entering a place where I would finally belong. The wedding had been beautiful, full of laughter, music, and promises whispered softly under bright lights. Ian had held my hand with such warmth that I believed every word he said about building a peaceful life together. I trusted him completely. And because I trusted him, I trusted the home he was bringing me into. As the car stopped outside the house, I looked up at the tall gates and the neatly painted walls. It was larger than I expected, elegant in a way that felt slightly intimidating. I told myself it was just nerves. This was normal. Every new bride feels this way, I thought. Ian smiled at me as he opened the door, his calm presence giving me a sense of reassurance. "You'll love it here," he said softly. I nodded, forcing a small smile, trying to silence the uneasiness that had begun to settle in my chest. The front door opened before we could even knock. There she stood, my mother-in-law. Dressed perfectly, her posture straight, her expression controlled. Her smile appeared almost instantly, but there was something about it that didn't feel natural. It was too precise, too measured, like it had been practiced many times before. Still, I bent slightly as a sign of respect, greeting her politely. She stepped forward and pulled me into a tight embrace. For a moment, it felt warm. Comforting, even. But then she leaned closer, her grip tightening just enough to make me notice, and whispered something that made my heart skip a beat. "This is my home," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. It wasn't loud enough for anyone else to hear, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. I pulled back slowly, searching her face for any sign that she was joking, but her smile remained unchanged, as if nothing unusual had just been said. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just her way of setting boundaries. Maybe she didn't mean anything by it. After all, I was new here. It made sense that she would feel protective of her space. I convinced myself to let it go, pushing the thought to the back of my mind as I stepped inside. The house was spotless, almost too perfect. Every piece of furniture was arranged with precision, every surface shining. It didn't feel like a home where people lived freely. It felt like a place where everything had to stay exactly as it was. I noticed how carefully I placed my steps, as if I was afraid of disturbing something invisible. Ian walked beside me casually, completely at ease, which made me feel even more aware of how out of place I seemed. Relatives moved around us, offering smiles, congratulations, and curious glances. I tried to focus on them, on the warmth of their words, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned my head slightly, I caught my mother-in-law observing me, not openly, but enough for me to notice. Her eyes followed my movements, studying, measuring, as if she was already forming an opinion about me. Later, as the house quieted down and the guests began to leave, I found myself standing alone in the living room for a moment. The silence felt heavier than it should have. I took a deep breath, trying to relax, reminding myself that this was just the beginning. Things would settle. They always do. I just needed time to adjust, and so did she. When Ian joined me, he wrapped his arm around my shoulders gently. "Everything okay?" he asked. I hesitated for a second, thinking about what she had said earlier, but then I smiled and nodded. "Yes, just a little tired," I replied. He didn't question it further, and part of me was relieved. I didn't want to create any tension on the very first day. As the evening turned into night, I was shown to the room that would now be mine. Ours. It was beautifully arranged, decorated with care, but even there, I felt like a guest rather than someone who belonged. I placed my suitcase in the corner, slowly opening it, taking out my things one by one. Each item felt like a small piece of my old life. Something familiar in a place that didn't yet feel like home. From outside the room, I could hear faint movements, footsteps, doors opening and closing, quiet voices. The house was alive, but I didn't feel a part of it yet. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me. My mind drifted back to that whisper again, repeating it over and over, trying to understand why it bothered me so much. Maybe it was the way she said it. Not angry, not loud, but certain. Like a rule that had already been set long before I arrived. I wondered if I would always feel this way here, careful, watched, slightly out of place. Or if, with time, things would change. I told myself I would try. I would be patient, respectful, understanding. I would do everything I could to make this work. Because this was my new life now, and I wanted it to be a happy one. I wanted to believe that the warmth I had imagined wasn't just a dream, that somewhere beneath that perfect smile, there was kindness waiting to be seen. And yet, deep down, a quiet voice inside me kept asking a question I wasn't ready to answer. The first few days passed in a blur of adjustment, polite conversations, and careful observation. I woke up early, even before anyone else, trying to prove mostly to myself that I could fit into this new life without causing trouble. I made tea the way I had been taught, arranged the breakfast table neatly, and tried to anticipate what might be expected of me. At first, my mother-in-law watched quietly, her expressions neutral, her silence harder to read than words. I took that silence as approval, convincing myself that I was doing well. But it didn't take long for that silence to turn into something else. It started with small corrections, almost gentle on the surface. "We don't use that cup for tea," she said one morning, taking it from my hand and replacing it with another. I nodded quickly, apologizing, even though I had it known. The next day it was about the way I folded the napkins. "Not like that," she murmured, unfolding them and demonstrating the right way, with slow, deliberate movements. I watched carefully, memorizing every detail, determined not to repeat the mistake. Each comment seemed small on its own, easy to overlook. But together they began to build a quiet pressure around me. Every action I took felt like it was being evaluated. The way I walked, the way I spoke, even the way I sat during meals, nothing escaped her attention. I started second-guessing myself constantly, replaying my actions in my mind, wondering what I had done wrong this time. Ian noticed none of it, or if he did, he chose not to say anything. When I mentioned it casually one evening, trying to keep my tone light, he smiled and shrugged. "She's just like that," he said. "She likes things done her way. Don't take it seriously." His words were meant to comfort me, but they did the opposite. If this was just how she was, then it meant nothing would change. I tried harder after that. I woke up earlier, worked faster, paid closer attention. I adjusted my cooking to match her preferences, even when they were completely different from what I was used to. I changed the way I dressed around the house, choosing simpler clothes because she once mentioned that bright colors are unnecessary indoors. I even lowered my voice when speaking, remembering how she had once said, "There's no need to be loud in a respectable home." Despite all my efforts, the corrections didn't stop. In fact, they became more frequent, more direct. "You should learn properly," she said one afternoon while watching me clean. "These basic things shouldn't need to be taught." I felt my face burn with embarrassment, but I stayed quiet, nodding as if I agreed. Arguing didn't feel like an option, not here, not yet. What hurt the most wasn't just what she said, but how easily she dismissed anything I tried to do right. There was no acknowledgement, no small moment of approval to hold on to. It was as if nothing I did was ever enough, as if I was constantly falling short of a standard I couldn't fully understand. One evening, while preparing dinner, I overheard her speaking to a neighbor who had stopped by. I wasn't trying to listen, but their voices carried through the hallway. "Girls these days come useless," she said with a soft laugh. "No skills, no discipline. Good thing I'm training her." The words hit harder than I expected. I stood there for a moment, frozen, the spoon in my hand trembling slightly. Training her. as if I wasn't a person, but a project. Something to be fixed, shaped, controlled. I finished cooking in silence that night, my movements slower, heavier. When we sat down to eat, I avoided looking at her, focusing instead on my plate. Ayan chatted casually about his day, completely unaware of the storm building inside me. I wanted to say something, to tell him what I had heard, but the words stayed stuck in my throat. I wasn't sure if he would understand or if he would simply brush it off again. After dinner, as I cleared the table, she watched me closely. "Make sure you clean everything properly," she said. I don't like repeating myself. I nodded without meeting her eyes, carrying the dishes to the kitchen. The sink filled quickly, the sound of running water echoing in the quiet space. I stared at my reflection in the small window above the sink, barely recognizing the person looking back at me. I had always been confident, independent, sure of myself. But here, in this house, I felt smaller with each passing day. Not because I lacked ability, but because I was being made to feel like I did. Every correction, every comment chipped away at something inside me, replacing confidence with doubt. Still, I told myself to be patient. It had only been a few days. Maybe this was just part of the adjustment. Maybe she needed time to accept me, just as I needed time to understand her. I held onto that thought tightly, using it as a reason to keep going, to keep trying. But deep down, something had already begun to shift. A quiet awareness, a growing realization that this wasn't just about learning a new household or adapting to a different routine. It was about something deeper, something more controlling, more intentional. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, that realization refused to fade. By the third week, the rhythm of the house had changed, and so had my place in it. What had once felt like small corrections and constant observation slowly turned into clear expectations, unspoken, but firmly enforced. I no longer waited to be told what to do. I already knew. Or at least, I believed I did. Every morning began before sunrise, my body waking up out of habit rather than rest. The first sound I heard each day was the quiet ticking of the clock, reminding me that I had a long list of tasks ahead. I moved through the house silently, preparing tea, sweeping the floors, organizing the kitchen, and setting up breakfast before anyone else came in. There was no acknowledgement of effort, no conversation about how things were going. It was as if this routine had always been mine, as if I had stepped into a role that had been waiting for me long before I arrived. My mother-in-law rarely helped with anything anymore. She would sit comfortably in the living room, giving instructions without looking directly at me. "Make sure the curtains are clean today. The floor doesn't look polished properly. Don't forget to iron the clothes before noon." Her tone wasn't loud or angry. It was calm, controlled, and constant. That made it harder to question. It didn't sound like a request. It sounded like authority. At first, I told myself this was temporary. Maybe she just wanted to test my abilities. Maybe once she trusted me, things would ease. But with each passing day, the workload increased instead of decreasing. Tasks piled up faster than I could complete them. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, organizing everything became my responsibility. Even the smallest things were handed to me without a second thought. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the kitchen, trying to prepare lunch while also washing dishes from breakfast that I hadn't had time to finish earlier. My hands moved quickly, but my mind felt slow, heavy. I paused for a moment, leaning slightly against the counter, trying to catch my breath. Before I could even take a proper break, her voice came from the living room. "Why are you stopping? There's still work left." I straightened immediately, forcing myself to continue. "Yes," I replied softly, even though she couldn't see me. My chest felt tight, but I ignored it. There was no space for rest here, no moment where I could simply pause without being noticed. What hurt more than the physical exhaustion was the way my identity began to fade within those walls. I was no longer seen as a person with thoughts, feelings, or limits. I had become a functional role that existed only to serve the needs of the household. Conversations with her were no longer about getting to know me. They were about instructions, corrections, and expectations. One day, while arranging the living room, I overheard her speaking to a neighbor again. I wasn't close enough to see them, but their voices carried clearly through the hallway. "At least now the house is running properly," she said. "Before, I had to do everything myself. Now she handles it all." There was a hint of satisfaction in her voice, a quiet pride that made something inside me sink. Handles it all. Not helps, not contributes. Handles it. I continued adjusting the cushions, pretending I hadn't heard anything. But her words stayed with me. They weren't just casual remarks. They were a reflection of how she saw me, and how she wanted others to see me. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I noticed my hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. I hadn't sat down properly the entire day. My feet ached, my back felt stiff, and my mind was constantly racing, trying to remember what needed to be done next. Still, I pushed through, focusing on finishing everything on time. When Ian returned home, I hoped, even if just a little, that he would notice, that he would see how much had changed. But he walked in, greeted his mother warmly, and sat down as if everything was normal. I served dinner quietly, placing each dish carefully on the table. He smiled at me briefly, thanking me, but it felt automatic, distant. During the meal, his mother spoke about the house, about how things were finally in order. He nodded in agreement, adding, "That's good, it should be like this." I looked down at my plate, my appetite disappearing completely. It wasn't just her expectations anymore. It was becoming the standard for everyone in the house. After dinner, as I cleared the table, I felt a strange mix of emotions building inside me. Not just sadness or frustration, but something deeper, something heavier. It wasn't about one comment or one task. It was about the pattern, the constant pressure, the way everything seemed to be shifting without anyone questioning it. I realized that I hadn't had a single moment to myself in days. No time to think, to rest, or even to feel. Every part of my day was controlled by someone else's expectations. And the more I tried to meet those expectations, the further they seemed to move. Later that night, as I stood alone in the kitchen, washing the last of the dishes, the house finally quiet, I felt something inside me change. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. A small crack forming beneath the surface of everything I had been holding in. I stared at my reflection again, barely visible in the dark window. My face looked tired, my eyes distant. I searched for the person I used to be. The one who had walked into this house with hope and confidence. She felt far away now, almost like a memory rather than reality. For the first time, I allowed myself to question everything, not just her behavior, but my own silence. I had been patient, understanding, willing to adjust. But somewhere along the way, that patience had turned into quiet acceptance of something that didn't feel right. And as that realization settled in, I felt a shift within me that I couldn't ignore anymore. The day everything changed didn't begin any differently from the others. I woke up before sunrise, my body already conditioned to the routine that had taken over my life. The house was quiet, and for a brief moment, I stood still in the kitchen, staring at the empty space around me. There was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain, like something was waiting to happen. I shook the feeling away and got to work, moving through the tasks automatically: tea, breakfast, cleaning, organizing, each step blending into the next without pause. By afternoon, the exhaustion had already begun to settle deep into my bones. I hadn't rested properly in days, and even the smallest tasks felt heavier than usual. Still, I kept going. There was no room for mistakes, no space for slowing down. Every movement felt like it was being watched, even when she wasn't in the room. Dinner preparation started earlier than usual that evening. She had guests coming over, and everything had to be perfect. The pressure was clear in her tone as she listed instructions one after another. Make sure the food is fresh. Don't overcook the rice. Set the table properly. I nodded each time, absorbing every word, trying to hold everything together in my mind without letting anything slip. The kitchen felt smaller than usual, the heat from the stove making it hard to breathe. I moved quickly between pots and dishes, checking, tasting, adjusting. My hands were working fast, but my body felt slower, weaker. I hadn't eaten properly all day, and the lack of energy was starting to show. Still, I refused to stop. Not tonight. Not when everything had to be perfect. By the time dinner was ready, my head was slightly dizzy, but I ignored it. I carefully carried the dishes to the table, arranging everything exactly the way she liked it. The guests arrived shortly after, their voices filling the house with laughter and conversation. I stayed in the background, moving in and out quietly, making sure everything ran smoothly. When it was time to serve dinner, I picked up a plate from the kitchen, my grip slightly unsteady. As I stepped toward the table, my foot caught the edge of the rug. It was a small misstep, something that could have been corrected in a second. But my balance was already off. The plate slipped from my hands and crashed onto the floor, the sound sharp and sudden, cutting through the room like a crack of thunder. Everything went silent. For a moment, no one moved. I stood there frozen, staring at the broken pieces scattered across the floor. My heart was pounding, my breath uneven. I knew what was coming before it even happened. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her expression had changed completely. The controlled calmness was gone, replaced by something sharper, colder. "What is wrong with you?" she snapped, her voice louder than I had ever heard before. "I'm sorry," I said quickly, my voice barely steady as I bent down to pick up the pieces. But before I could gather them, her words came again, louder this time, echoing through the room. "You're just a housemaid now. Act like one." The sentence hit harder than anything she had said before. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, openly, in front of everyone, without hesitation or restraint. There was no attempt to hide it anymore. No pretense of correction or guidance. Just a clear declaration of how she saw me. I froze again, my hand still hovering over the broken glass. The room remained silent, but this silence felt different. It wasn't shock, it was discomfort. I could feel the guests watching, unsure of what to say, choosing to say nothing at all. Slowly, I lifted my head and looked around the table. My eyes stopped on Ion. For a brief second, I held on to a small hope that he would say something, that he would step in, that he would see how wrong this was. But he didn't. He sat there quietly, his gaze lowered, avoiding the moment entirely. That silence hurt more than her words. Something inside me shifted in that exact moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. It felt like a line had been crossed, one that couldn't be ignored or undone. I wasn't just tired anymore. I wasn't just adjusting. I had been reduced to something less than myself, and everyone had allowed it to happen. I stood up slowly, my movements calm despite the storm building inside me. "I'll clean it," I said quietly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked back into the kitchen. My hands moved automatically as I grabbed a cloth and returned to the floor, carefully picking up the broken pieces. Each small shard felt symbolic, like something inside me had shattered along with that plate. But instead of breaking me, it was doing something else. Something I hadn't expected. As I cleaned, her words repeated in my mind over and over again. "You're just a housemaid now." This time I didn't try to push them away. I let them settle, let them sink in completely. Because for the first time, I wasn't feeling just hurt. I was feeling something sharper, clearer. I finished cleaning without saying another word, returning to the kitchen to compose myself. My reflection in the metal surface of the cabinet caught my attention again. My face was pale, my eyes tired, but there was something new there. Something that hadn't been there before. The quiet acceptance that had defined me until now was gone. In its place, something else had begun to take shape. Something calm but unyielding. Something that didn't rush or react impulsively, because in that moment, I wasn't thinking about defending myself anymore. I was thinking about what I would do next. The night after the dinner incident, I didn't cry the way I thought I would. I didn't sit in a corner feeling broken or defeated. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my mind with unusual clarity. Her words echoed again and again, but this time they didn't weaken me. They sharpened something inside me. For the first time since entering that house, I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was thinking. The next morning, I woke up at the same early hour. But something felt different. My body still moved through the routine breakfast, cleaning. But my mind was no longer focused on pleasing anyone. Instead, it was observing, calculating. I watched everything more closely now. The way she spoke, the way she gave instructions, the way she assumed control over every detail of the house. It wasn't random behavior. It was a pattern, and patterns could be understood. I stopped trying to impress her. That was the first change. I still did the work, but not with the same desperate need for approval. My actions became quieter, more controlled, more deliberate. I spoke less, listened more, and responded only when necessary. From the outside, nothing had changed. I was still the same obedient daughter-in-law. But inside, something had shifted completely. What she didn't know, and what I had carefully kept hidden, was that I had never truly depended on this house for survival. Before marriage, I had built something of my own, a small but stable financial foundation. I had invested my savings wisely, something I had learned long before this life began. Even after marriage, I continued working remotely, managing my responsibilities in silence, making sure no one questioned where my independence came from. It wasn't something I had planned to hide forever. But in that house, I quickly realized that independence was not something they would welcome, so I kept it to myself, protecting it like a quiet shield. Alongside that, I began documenting everything. At first, it felt strange, almost unnecessary. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I started noting down her words, her tone, the situations where she crossed a line. Sometimes I used my phone discreetly, recording conversations when I knew something might happen. Other times I simply wrote things down in detail, making sure nothing was forgotten. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about clarity, about understanding exactly what I was dealing with. Days passed, and her behavior didn't change. If anything, she became more comfortable in her authority, more open in her assumptions about me. Make sure this is done before noon. Don't forget to clean the storage room. You need to improve your speed. Her voice carried the same calm dominance, as if she had already defined my role permanently. But now, instead of feeling smaller with each command, I listened differently. I wasn't absorbing her words emotionally anymore. I was analyzing them, separating tone from intent, behavior from pattern. It gave me a strange kind of control, not over her, but over how I reacted. One afternoon, while cleaning the living room, I noticed a stack of papers on the table. Normally, I would have ignored them, but something about the way they were placed caught my attention. They weren't arranged neatly like everything else in the house. Curious, I glanced at them briefly. Financial documents, property-related papers. I didn't read everything in detail, but I saw enough to understand one thing. The house wasn't as secure as it appeared. That realization stayed with me. I didn't act on it immediately. Instead, I filed it away in my mind, another piece of a puzzle that was slowly coming together. If there was one thing I had learned by now, it was that acting too quickly would only weaken my position. Patience had become my strongest advantage. At the same time, I started reconnecting with parts of myself that I had almost forgotten. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I would sit with my laptop, reviewing my work, managing my finances, making small but important decisions about my future. It reminded me of who I was before I entered this house. Someone capable, independent, and in control of her own life. That version of me hadn't disappeared. It had only been pushed aside. Ayan remained distant, unchanged. He didn't question anything, didn't notice the subtle shift in me. Or maybe he did, but chose not to engage with it. I stopped expecting anything from him. That too was a decision. The less I depended on his response, the clearer my own thinking became. As the days went on, my silence took on a different meaning. It was no longer weakness. It was strategy. Every word I didn't say, every reaction I held back, was intentional. I wasn't avoiding confrontation. I was preparing for it. And slowly, very carefully, I began shaping a plan. Not something rushed or emotional, but something precise. Something that would not only change my situation, but redefine it completely. I didn't know exactly when the moment would come, but I knew it would. And when it did, I wouldn't be standing there uncertain or unprepared. Because this time, I wasn't just surviving in that house I was waiting. By the time I reached the point of questioning Ian, it wasn't out of sudden anger or desperation. It came from a place of clarity that had been building quietly over days. I had observed enough, understood enough, and felt enough to know that I couldn't move forward without knowing where he truly stood. Up until now, I had avoided putting him in that position. I had convinced myself that maybe he just didn't see things the way I did, or maybe he believed it was normal, but that uncertainty was no longer something I could ignore. That evening, the house was unusually calm. His mother had gone to visit a relative, and for the first time in weeks, the atmosphere felt lighter, almost unfamiliar. I finished my tasks earlier than usual and sat in the living room waiting. Not passively, but with intention. I knew I needed this conversation, and I knew I needed to approach it carefully. When Ian walked in, he seemed relaxed, unaware of the weight of what I was about to ask. He greeted me with a small smile, loosening his tie as he sat down. For a moment, I simply watched him, trying to read his expression, trying to understand if there was anything beneath the surface I hadn't noticed before. "I need to ask you something," I said finally, my voice steady but quiet. He looked at me, slightly surprised by my tone. "What is it?" I hesitated for just a second, choosing my words with precision. "Do you think I'm just a servant in this house?" The question hung in the air between us, heavier than I expected. For a brief moment, he didn't respond. His eyes shifted slightly, as if searching for the easiest way to answer. That hesitation alone told me more than I wanted to know. "Why would you say that?" he replied, his tone careful, almost defensive. "Just answer me," I said, not raising my voice, but not backing down either. He leaned back slightly, exhaling as if the question itself was unnecessary. "You're overthinking," he said. "It's not like that." I held his gaze, waiting. That wasn't an answer. After a short pause, he added, "Look, it's just how things are here. My mother has her way of running the house. It's easier if you just adjust." Adjust. That word again. I felt something settle inside me. Something final. "So you think this is normal?" I asked. He shrugged lightly. "It's not a big deal. You're making it bigger than it is. Just don't take everything personally." His words were calm, almost dismissive, as if what I was experiencing didn't carry enough weight to be taken seriously. There was no anger in his voice, no cruelty, but there was something else. Indifference. And somehow, that felt worse. I studied his face carefully, looking for any sign of discomfort, any hint that he understood what I was going through. But there was nothing. He wasn't conflicted. He wasn't struggling to choose sides. In his mind, there were no sides to choose. That realization was quiet but powerful. It wasn't that he didn't care about me at all. It was that he prioritized peace over truth, comfort over confrontation. As long as the house remained stable, as long as there were no loud arguments or visible problems, everything was acceptable to him. My discomfort didn't disrupt that balance, so it didn't demand action. For a moment, I considered pushing further, explaining everything in detail, forcing him to see what I saw. But something stopped me. Not fear clarity. If he couldn't see it by now, after everything that had happened, then explaining it wouldn't change anything. It would only lead to more dismissal, more quiet avoidance. "I understand," I said simply. He nodded, relieved that the conversation wasn't turning into something complicated. "Good. Don't stress yourself over small things. Small things." I didn't respond, Instead, I leaned back slightly, letting the silence settle between us. But this silence felt different from the ones before. It wasn't filled with uncertainty or hesitation. It was clear, defined, almost calm. In that moment, I stopped expecting anything from him. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no anger, no visible reaction. Just a quiet shift in perspective. I had been holding on to the idea that he might stand beside me, that he might recognize what was happening and choose to address it. But now, that expectation was gone. And with it, a strange sense of freedom followed. I didn't need his validation to understand my situation. I didn't need his support to define what was right or wrong. For the first time, I saw things exactly as they were, without trying to soften them or explain them away. He wasn't my ally in this. And that meant I had to rely entirely on myself. Later that night, as I returned to the kitchen to finish the remaining tasks, my movements felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just more certain. Every action I took now had a purpose beyond routine. I wasn't just completing chores. I was maintaining a role, one that allowed me to stay unnoticed while I continued preparing for what was ahead. His words replayed in my mind, not as something that hurt me, but as something that confirmed what I needed to know. Just adjust. That was his solution. That was his answer to everything. But I wasn't going to adjust anymore. Not in the way he meant. As I stood there, the quiet hum of the house surrounding me, I realized that this conversation had given me more than clarity about him. It had removed the last doubt I had been holding on to. There was no one else to wait for, no one else to convince, and that made my next steps clearer than ever. After that conversation with Ayan, everything became sharper, more defined. There was no longer any confusion about where I stood or what I needed to do. The house felt the same on the surface, same routines, same instructions, same controlled atmosphere, but my perspective had completely changed. I was no longer trying to fit into it. I was studying it, understanding it as a system I needed to outgrow, not adapt to. The idea that had quietly formed in my mind days earlier began to take shape more clearly. It wasn't something emotional or impulsive. It was precise, logical. I had already noticed signs that the house wasn't as secure as it appeared. The documents I had seen, the small inconsistencies in conversations, the way certain topics were avoided, it all pointed to something beneath the surface. And if there was one thing I understood well, it was that control often hides vulnerability. I didn't act immediately. Instead, I moved carefully, making sure nothing about my behavior raised suspicion. I continued my daily routine exactly as before. I woke up early, completed every task, followed every instruction without question. If anything, I became even more efficient, more quiet, more predictable. From the outside, I was exactly what they expected me to be. But behind that routine, I started gathering information. Late at night, when the house was silent, I returned to my laptop. I reviewed financial records, checked property listings, and searched for details connected to the house. It took time, patience, and focus, but slowly, the picture became clearer. The property wasn't fully stable. There were financial pressures, obligations that had been hidden, decisions that had been delayed. It wasn't something obvious enough to alarm outsiders, but it was enough to create an opening. That opening was all I needed. I contacted a lawyer quietly, using my own resources, making sure every step remained confidential. I didn't rush into explanations. Instead, I presented the facts, asked precise questions, and listened carefully. The process required careful planning, but it wasn't impossible. In fact, the more I learned, the more I realized how achievable it was. The house, her symbol of authority, her foundation of control, was not untouchable. Once I confirmed that the property could legally be purchased, everything shifted from possibility to strategy. I structured my finances, reviewed my investments, and made decisions I had been preparing for long before I ever stepped into that house. Every choice was calculated, every step aligned with a clear outcome. At the same time, I continued documenting everything at home. Her behavior hadn't changed. If anything, she had grown more confident in her authority, more comfortable in her assumptions about me. Make sure this is done today. You need to be faster. Don't forget your responsibilities. Her words continued, steady and repetitive, reinforcing the role she believed I had accepted. But I hadn't accepted anything. I simply allowed her to believe I had. Ayan remained the same, distant, neutral, uninvolved. Our conversations became minimal, functional. There was no tension, but there was no connection either. It felt like we were existing in parallel, sharing the same space but not the same reality. I no longer tried to change that. It wasn't part of my focus anymore. As the days passed, the process moved forward. Documents were prepared, approvals were arranged, and every legal detail was handled with precision. I made sure everything was complete before taking the final step. There was no room for error, no space for uncertainty. If I was going to do this, it had to be absolute. The day I signed the final papers, I felt something settle inside me. Not excitement, not relief, but certainty. The house that had been used to diminish me, to control me, to define my place without my consent, was now legally mine. Not symbolically, not emotionally. Legally. I didn't react outwardly. I didn't celebrate or reveal anything. I returned home that day exactly as I always did, carrying the same calm expression, moving through the same routine. Dinner was prepared, the house was cleaned, instructions were followed. Nothing appeared different. But everything was. I observed her more closely that evening, noticing the same confidence in her posture, the same authority in her voice. She spoke as if nothing could challenge her position, as if the structure of the house itself supported her completely. She had no idea that the foundation beneath her control had already shifted. And that was intentional. Because the power of what I had done wasn't just in the action itself. It was in the timing. In the reveal. In the moment when everything she believed would be replaced by something she couldn't deny. I didn't rush that moment. Instead, I waited. I allowed a few more days to pass, maintaining the same routine, the same silence, the same role she had assigned to me. Every instruction she gave, I followed. Every assumption she made, I let stand. Because each of those moments would make what came next even clearer, even more undeniable. At night, I reviewed everything once more. The documents, the legal confirmations, the evidence I had gathered. Everything was in place. There were no gaps, no weaknesses. It wasn't just a plan anymore. It was a completed structure, ready to be revealed. For the first time since I entered that house, I felt fully in control, not just of my actions, but of the outcome itself. And as I stood there, looking around the same walls that had once made me feel small, I understood something with complete clarity. This was no longer her house. And very soon, she was going to find out. The day I chose for the revelation looked completely ordinary on the surface. The house followed its usual rhythm, unchanged and predictable. My mother-in-law moved around with her usual confidence, giving instructions, correcting small things, and asserting control over every corner of the space as if it had always belonged entirely to her. Ayan left early for work without noticing anything different, and the rest of the morning passed in silence, broken only by routine tasks. That calmness was exactly what I needed. I had already prepared everything in advance. The documents were in order, the legal confirmation secured, and every detail verified multiple times. Nothing was left uncertain. Still, I did not rush into the moment. I wanted the timing to be exact, not emotional. I had learned that control is not only about power, but also about patience, and I had been patient long enough. By midday, I informed both of them that we needed to sit together for a family discussion. I kept my tone neutral, almost casual, as if it were about something ordinary. My mother-in-law glanced at me briefly, slightly irritated at the interruption of her routine, but she agreed without question. She assumed, as always, that whatever I had to say would not matter much in the larger structure of the house. We gathered in the living room. She sat comfortably in her usual chair, positioned like someone who owned not just the furniture but the atmosphere itself. Ayan sat beside her, relaxed, unaware of the tension building quietly in the room. I stood for a moment, not out of hesitation, but to observe. This was the space where I had spent months shrinking myself, adjusting, obeying, and remaining silent. Today, I was not the same person in that space. I placed the file on the table in front of them. At first, there was no reaction. My mother-in-law looked at it with mild curiosity, as if expecting something insignificant. Ayan leaned forward slightly, still unaware of what was about to unfold. I took a breath, steady and controlled, and began speaking. "This house," I said calmly, "is now legally in my name." The silence that followed was immediate, but not yet meaningful to them. My mother-in-law let out a short laugh, almost dismissive. "What kind of joke is this?" she asked, her tone sharp but unconcerned. She reached for the documents without urgency, assuming she would quickly dismiss whatever I had brought. Ayan looked confused, shifting his gaze between me and the papers. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice uncertain but still not alarmed. I didn't respond immediately. I simply waited. She opened the file, scanning the first page quickly. Her expression began to change slightly, but not enough yet to fully register concern. She turned the pages faster, her confidence still present, as if she was looking for the part that would confirm it with a misunderstanding. But the confirmation she was searching for never came. The more she read, the quieter she became. Ayan leaned closer now, taking the documents from her hands. His eyes moved across the pages more carefully. The shift in his expression was slower, but more visible. Confusion gave way to disbelief, and disbelief slowly gave way to realization. This is real?" he finally asked. I nodded once. My mother-in-law stood up abruptly. "This is impossible," she said immediately, her voice rising. "You cannot do this. This house belongs to us." I looked at her directly for the first time without hesitation. "It belonged to you," I replied calmly, "until the legal ownership was transferred." She shook her head, refusing to accept it. "No, you must have manipulated something. This cannot be real." But I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed the remaining documents on the table, clear, verified, undeniable. Ayan remained silent for a long moment, reading again as if repetition might change the meaning. But it didn't. The reality was the same every time. Finally, he spoke, but his voice lacked certainty. "Why would you do this without telling anyone?" I turned to him. "Because I didn't need permission to secure my future," I said. My tone remained steady, not emotional, not aggressive. Just final. The room felt different now. The balance had shifted, but not explosively. It was quieter than that. More irreversible. My mother-in-law's confidence began to break down in visible layers. Her posture changed. Her voice no longer carried the same authority. "You think this makes you powerful?" she asked, trying to regain control through tone alone. "I think it makes things clear," I replied. Ayan looked between both of us, as if searching for a version of reality that still made sense. But there wasn't one anymore. The structure he had relied on, the idea that everything would remain balanced if no one questioned it, had already collapsed. I took a step closer to the table, placing my hand lightly on the documents. "This is not about power," I said quietly. "It's about ownership." And clarity. The silence that followed was no longer neutral. It was heavy, filled with realization, resistance, and the beginning of acceptance in places where denial no longer worked. For the first time, my mother-in-law did not speak immediately. She simply stood there, staring at the papers as if they had rewritten the entire structure of her world. And I remained exactly where I was, no longer waiting for permission, explanation, or approval. Because everything that needed to be said had already been placed in front of them without room for denial. The silence in the room after the revelation did not disappear quickly. It stayed thick and uncomfortable, as if the air itself had changed. My mother-in-law was no longer sitting in her usual position of control. She stood near the table, staring at the documents repeatedly, as if looking at them long enough might undo what they confirmed. Ayan remained seated, but his posture had shifted. The calm confidence he usually carried was gone. replaced by uncertainty he didn't know how to express. For a few moments, no one spoke. I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. I had already said what needed to be said. Now, it was their turn to process it. I simply stood there, watching them, no longer as someone seeking approval or fearing reaction, but as someone observing the outcome of a decision already made. My mother-in-law was the first to break. "This is not acceptable," she said sharply, her voice trying to regain its usual authority. "You cannot just take over something like this. This house has been in our family's control for years." I looked at her calmly. "Control and ownership are not the same thing," I replied. Her eyes narrowed. "Do you think this makes you superior?" I shook my head slightly. "No. It just makes things honest." That word seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. She had always operated in a space where authority was assumed, not questioned. Now that assumption had been removed, and she didn't know how to respond to it. Ian finally stood up, running a hand through his hair, visibly conflicted. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "You should have talked to us before doing something this serious." I turned toward him slowly. "I did not need permission to secure something I was legally entitled to," I said. "And I didn't do it in secret. I did it carefully." He looked down, unable to argue with facts he was just beginning to fully understand. That was when I noticed something important. It wasn't just shock he was feeling. It was discomfort from realizing that the structure he had always relied on, his mother's control, his silence, and my compliance, was no longer intact. My mother-in-law stepped forward again, her frustration building. "So what now? You expect us to just leave?" I paused for a moment before answering. "I expect clarity," I said. "Not chaos, not denial, just clarity." The words seemed to land differently this time, not as a challenge, but as a conclusion. She let out a short laugh, but it lacked confidence. "You think you can just erase everything I built here?" I met her gaze directly. "Nothing is being erased," I said. "What is changing is who has the authority to decide how this space is managed." For the first time, she didn't have a quick response. Ayan looked between us, clearly struggling. "This doesn't have to turn into something like this," he said, trying to soften the situation. "We can figure it out together." But I had already moved past that stage. "We already did figure it out," I said calmly. "You just didn't realize it was happening." That silence returned again, but this time it felt final, not temporary. My mother-in-law slowly sat down again, but this time her posture was different. The confidence she once carried so naturally had been replaced with something quieter, less certain. She was still trying to hold on to her identity within the house, but the foundation supporting it was no longer the same. Ian remained standing for a few seconds longer, then sat back down. He wasn't defeated, but he was no longer in control of the narrative he had assumed was permanent. I stepped back slightly, not to distance myself emotionally, but to allow space for the reality to settle. "I am not asking for conflict," I said after a moment. "I am not here to remove anyone forcefully or create instability. But I will not continue living in a structure where my role is defined by silence and assumption." My voice remained steady, not emotional, not aggressive. It was the kind of clarity that does not seek approval. My mother-in-law looked at me again, but differently this time. There was resistance still present, but beneath it, something else was beginning to form. Awareness. Not acceptance, but recognition that the situation was no longer reversible. Ayan finally spoke again. Softer now. "So what do you want to happen?" I took a moment before answering, because the answer was not about punishment or revenge. It was about direction. "I want things to be decided based on reality," I said. "Not assumptions. Not history. Not expectations that were never agreed upon." The room fell quiet once more. But this silence was different from before. It was no longer filled with shock or denial. It was filled with the beginning of understanding that the structure they had known was no longer the same. I could feel the shift clearly now, not as a victory, but as a transition. The moment when resistance starts to lose its weight and reality begins to settle in its place. No one spoke after that for a long time. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been placed in front of them, leaving only the question of what would come next. And for the first time, that question no longer depended on their assumptions or control. The morning after the confrontation felt unusually still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Nothing had changed physically, but everything felt different. The walls, the furniture, even the way footsteps echoed through the hallway carried a different meaning now. It was no longer a space defined by unquestioned authority. It had become a space of transition, where every action felt observed, not by control, but by consequence. My mother-in-law stayed in her room for most of the morning. For the first time since I had entered that house, she did not appear at dawn to give instructions or inspect the day's routine. The absence was noticeable. Not peaceful. Not tense. Just unfamiliar. Ayan moved through the house quietly, avoiding unnecessary conversation. There was no argument, no resolution, just a slow realization settling over everyone in different ways. I continued my routine, but not out of obligation anymore. I cooked because I chose to. I cleaned because it was still part of my environment. But the emotional weight behind every action had shifted. I was no longer performing under silent pressure. I was acting with awareness. When my mother-in-law finally came out of her room, it was late in the morning. She looked different, not broken, not defeated, but less certain than before. The confidence she once carried as naturally as breathing was now restrained, as if she was carefully measuring each movement. She avoided direct confrontation, but her presence still carried traces of resistance. She walked into the kitchen while I was preparing tea. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The same space that had once been filled with constant correction now felt suspended in neutrality. "You don't need to do everything yourself," she said finally, her tone controlled but noticeably restrained. I didn't respond immediately. I poured the tea and placed one cup in front of her. "I'm not doing everything," I said calmly. "I'm just doing what is necessary." She looked at the cup, then at me. There was something in her expression that suggested she was still adjusting to the shift in dynamics, still trying to understand where authority now stood. But she didn't challenge me. Ayan entered shortly after, looking equally unsettled, but more resigned than resistant. He glanced between us before speaking. "We need to figure out how things move forward," he said carefully. I nodded slightly. "That depends on whether we're still trying to hold on to how things used to be," I replied. He didn't answer immediately. That silence told me everything I needed to know. They were no longer operating from certainty. They were adapting, slowly, reluctantly. As the days passed, the structure of the house began to adjust itself in subtle ways. Instructions became fewer. Questions replaced commands. Decisions that were once assumed were now discussed, even if awkwardly. My presence was no longer treated as invisible labor, but as someone whose input existed whether they fully accepted it or not. My mother-in-law maintained distance at first, observing more than engaging. There was no apology, no admission, but there was a noticeable reduction in authority. The space she once controlled effortlessly now required negotiation, and that alone was a shift she was still learning to navigate. Ayan tried to bridge the gap between us, but even he realized that things could not return to how they were. The dynamic had permanently changed, not through conflict, but through exposure. The illusion of silent acceptance had been replaced with clarity, and clarity does not reverse easily. One evening, as I stood by the window, I realized something important. I was no longer waiting for validation, recognition, or permission. The emotional dependency that had quietly formed when I first entered this house was gone. In its place was something steadier: self-awareness. I had not destroyed anything. I had only revealed what was already unstable, and in that revelation, I had reclaimed something that had slowly been taken from me without my notice: my sense of direction. My mother-in-law eventually stopped trying to assert control in the same way. It wasn't surrender, but adjustment. A recognition that authority based on assumption no longer functioned the way it once did. Ian became quieter, more reflective, less certain in his assumptions about stability requiring silence. The house itself remained the same structure, but the way it was lived in had changed completely. There were no loud victories, no dramatic exits, no final confrontations. Instead, there was something more permanent taking shape, a new equilibrium built on awareness rather than dominance. And I no longer felt like someone trying to survive within it. I felt like someone who understood exactly where she stood and why it mattered. The story was never just about control or conflict. It was about realization, boundaries, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your place when everything around you tries to redefine it. Sometimes the most powerful change doesn't come through loud confrontation, but through calm decisions made with full awareness of your worth. And when silence is no longer used to suppress you, but to protect your clarity, everything begins to shift in ways no one expects.